An original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, look at that. It is the ultimate day of July 2023, the 31st of the month. Welcome in as we make the turn into August. It's now and next. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network. And I was just saying, on the weekend, I managed to attend a wedding in downtown Toronto. Saturday afternoon. And it was the eldest son of probably the longest friend I've had since I was in grade school. And the cool thing is there were other friends from that same grade school class sitting around the table and some high school friends. And I think at some point we sort of looked around the table and realized, holy crap, you know, we've known each other for more than half a century. And we still abide each other's company. And the neat part about it is that our kids all hang around together. My son, his best friend is a guy who lives in Hawaii now. And when they see each other, and they just did so recently, it's as if they just picking up where they left off, might be weeks, months, years ago. And I was sitting across the table from that young guy's dad and mom at the table the other night. So it's a pretty close group. So we're fairly grateful, I think, when we sit around and look at that on a number of levels. First, that we can do that again and see old friends and realize that, how much we actually missed, right? When we were all locked down and locked up and kind of shut down, if not shut up. and we managed our way through the last 3 years and how blurry it all was. And I think it really hit home because the mom and dad of the friend of mine, the elders, were at the gathering as well. And it was their reaction when they saw all of we young people coming into the room to say, oh, all of a sudden there was this real historic context to the whole thing. So, yeah, it was a nice wedding and all that and all the fun and the games and the gossip and goofiness that goes on at weddings. But I think that was the real important part of this, that we got together face to face, we shared a meal, we shared a beverage and told lies, and we'll promise to do it again. So I hope you've had the opportunity to do some of that over this summer when, with some exception, it's been a fairly good summer if you're trying to get away and enjoy the outdoors. All right, it is now and next, and it is a Monday morning, and a couple of things that we want to get to, not the least of which are some numbers coming out of Queen's Park as we look at the Ford government getting ready for, I don't know if it's a new legislative session, but it will certainly be a whole new focus legislatively for the Fords, because in the background, they will be facing all the momentum and excitement around whatever happens with the Liberals and their leadership here in the province of Ontario. Sabrina Nanji is all over it today. If you haven't checked out her newsletter, Queen's Park Observer, she's just talking about how the ad wars have started, even internally within the Liberal Party. The candidates all try and carve out their space. So what's that going to mean for the Fords as they head into the back half of this calendar year? And I want to get into some of the repercussions of the cabinet shuffle in Ottawa last week. We touched a little bit on it this past week, just in terms of what's it going to mean to the Canada Disability Act. There's a new minister there, but they've sharpened the focus of the ministry, so we'll look at that. But I think immigration is going to be front and center as we move into this new election cycle federally. So we'll talk about that. And who better to have at the table than David Coletto? He is the co-founder and the CEO at Abacus Data. How are you? Did you have a good weekend?
I'm doing well, Dave. Yeah, had a great weekend. Lovely weather here in Ottawa after some crazy thunderstorms at the end of the week last week. But summer's going too fast. It's crazy when you say August is tomorrow.
Yeah. No kidding, eh? Yeah.
Gosh.
I saw you were out took some time off out on your bikes, doing your cycling.
Yeah. well, that's pretty much every day in my world. But going away next weekend down to Maine with the bikes and the dog and my partner, and we're going to go and enjoy. Never been down there, so looking forward to that trip too.
Are you a Tour de France fan?
Oh, man, yeah. I'm coming off hangover now that it's over. July is the greatest month of the year.
Yeah, and we were talking about that on the weekend, and I used to watch it all the time. And now it's harder and harder to find the broadcast because the Canadian broadcasters just decided that there's no audience. It's just you and me, I guess, was watching it. Now it's just you.
It's true. You have to, there's only one streaming service, Flow Sports, that you can get it. I mean, you can use a VPN if you're so inclined to try to get around some of it. And there's some good content overseas in the UK. But yeah, it's a signal, right? When, something that would happen early in the morning most days, a network like Sportsnet or TSN is not interested at all in filling up 4 or 5 hours a day of easy content. I guess there's not enough people out there for it.
Yeah, well, I suspect TSN's audience is going to drop off this morning after the Canadian women were, as they put it, well beaten by the Australians 4-0, and now they're out.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I was, it is. I was I am engaged in the whole thing, and I think the post-tournament commentary around that team is going to be rather interesting. But that's not why you're here. Caught my attention last week when the Toronto Star was publishing some numbers that you had worked on, and two things came out of that story. One is that if an election were held on the day that you took the poll, Ford government would be returned in an outstanding majority. I mean, what was it, 40+ish, percent? And as our friend John Wright will say, they only need 37 to get a majority in this part of the world. But then the other part of it was more or less a perceptual question around the Fords. Let's start with the horse race. Is that, I'm going to guess that there are a number of factors here, not the least of which is still the Liberals don't have a leader. But the thing that strikes me is that the leader, Marit Stiles, and the NDP have, by all accounts, I think, fumbled a really great opportunity here with the Liberals down and out without a leader and no real direction, but they have dropped to third place.
Yeah, I mean, we as you said, 41% for the PCs, 24 Liberal, 23 NDP as a survey we had done the week prior, 1,000 people in the province. I mean, I think the story about an incumbent government is always, what is it going to take for the people who voted for that party to not vote for it next time, or signal to us in a survey that they don't plan to. And despite all of the ethical controversy swirling around the Ford government, the vast majority of people who voted for the PCs in 2022 say they would vote for them again. And right now, there's nothing that's going on in the Liberal Party and the New Democrats that is pulling people in, right? And so for most of the interim election period, it's more about the incumbent. And despite the fact that in this same survey, more than half of people across the province believe that Doug Ford and his government are making decisions in the best interests of their friends and supporters, not the public, and including a third of his own supporters believe that, that's not enough or sufficient for them to say, well, I wouldn't vote PC again. And so the way I framed it to Rob Benzie in the Star was, despite a lot of policy areas where people don't think the government's doing a good job, like housing and healthcare and affordability, despite all these ethical issues swirling around it, the PC party and Doug Ford have weathered the storm so far. The question is, when a Bonnie Crombie or a Nate Erskine, Smith or a Yasser Naqvi become leader of the Liberals, does that change the equation?
Well, yeah, and I always look at these things, and everybody tends to kind of look at it and say, well, this is a picture of how the government is doing or how the incumbent is doing on a given day. To me, it also speaks more loudly sometimes about the attitudes and the well-being, I put that in air quotes, of the electorate. I mean, to what degree are we really engaged in paying attention? If at some point you've got more than half those surveyed thinking there's something fishy going on here, but we really don't care enough to shift our vote. That says something interesting to me about the character of the electorate.
I think so, to some extent. It also perhaps demonstrates just our general skepticism of political leaders, right? Like, we didn't ask this question, but I do wonder if we had asked about, Merritt Stiles or Bonnie Crombie, whether they would make decisions that are in the best interests of their friends and supporters. I suspect a lot of people across the province would say yes to that as well, right? So there's one thing to say, I'm not excited about, or I'm really disappointed, or I'm angry about the way that you've governed, but I don't think the others are going to do any better. Then you get into a place where people aren't going to change their vote around this, and may not vote at all, which is why I think turnout has sunk to the historic lows that it's been in Ontario and municipally as well.
Yeah, maybe more than ever, we're into that devil you know approach to politics, and that's sort of why Ford was able to, kind of waltz back in without even showing up on the campaign trail, without really doing any media. There is that fatigue too, right?
There is. But last week, the day that we released, or the day after we released this poll, there were 2 by-elections in Ontario. Doug Ford lost both. He lost a seat that the PCs have basically held for 100 years, close to where I live, just west of Ottawa, Canada. And, while the Liberals had a really strong candidate, the New Democrats actually performed better in both seats than I think many people thought. It was like a 3-way race in Canada, a suburban Ottawa riding, a place you wouldn't normally think the NDP is going to get close to 30% of the vote. If I'm Doug Ford, I look at that result, just regardless of what my poll is saying, and perhaps feel a little unease, because it means that when voters are actually asked to judge the performance of the government, they chose not to, in a riding that, again, the Tories have won forever, and won by a substantial margin just a year ago, basically.
So how much of that, though, and I wondered, and it might be me being too cynical and even mean to suggest that, some of that lands on Marilee Fullerton. I mean, she was a disaster as a minister in that government and did not represent Ontarians well, never mind the riding.
Well, I think, somebody who lives in Ottawa. Ottawans feel very ignored by the Ford government, right? He's willing to dabble in Toronto politics. He maybe wishes he was mayor of Toronto, but it is very rare for Ottawa to get any love from this government until there's a by-election, and then they all showed up, right, for a cabinet retreat, and every cabinet minister showed up and campaigned out here. I think it's in part the previous MPP, Marion Fullerton, didn't really deliver much for Ottawa. And this was by-elections are really good for voters to send a signal and to, say enough's enough. If you take us for granted, we're going to show you that we're going to show up. And turnout wasn't great. It was 35%, but that's still surprisingly high for a mid-summer by-election. That's telling me that enough people wanted to send the government a signal.
Well, that's a better turnout than we had in the general election. Right?
Close to it. It's close. It's not much. Yeah, it's not much lower. I think it was like 3 points lower. Yeah. So that tells you, the psyche, I think, that's unique, that's happening here in Ottawa. So now there's only one progressive conservative MPP that represents the city of Ottawa. And that's the same riding that Pierre Poilievre held federally.
So much of what is splashing on the Fords is around, let's go back to that perception and doing things for your friends as opposed to doing things for the good of the province. And let's face it, at the center of that are the conversations swirling around the green belt. Ask you 2 things. First, if that's not resonating or making a difference, moving the needle, whatever we want to call it, in terms of voters, are the Liberals and the NDP not barking up the wrong tree? Every other word that comes out of their mouth is green belt?
I don't think I'm ready to say this issue doesn't have legs. I think it can. And I think, the thing that kills governments, that kills political careers, is the moment that voters decide, based on evidence or just their perception, that you're not in it for them, even a little bit. That's despite, as we said earlier, the skepticism that exists around all politicians, that's really hard to rebuild. And so if they can find clear evidence that decisions were made entirely to help friendly, developers or friends of the premier or friends of the party, that could hurt. Right now, the counter is you have to have a credible alternative. You've got to have someone in a party that people want to vote for. So that in itself is not going to defeat the PCs, the Liberals or the New Democrats, or both have to also offer up a compelling alternative. But I don't think it's barking up the wrong tree. The challenge in Ontario and Ontario politics is of probably all three levels of government, it's the one that people pay the least attention to. So you have to be able to, it's got to break through. And we did a surveys back in June asking people about, the stag and doe, and not a lot of people even knew that story was out there.
What's
right?
a stag and doe? Never mind what the story.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's you've got to keep at it, and you got to keep pushing, because it's even harder to get attention when it's provincial politics. But I think it's I've heard, and others have told me, that this is something that the Ford team is actually worried about, right? Because his strength during the pandemic and then coming out of it has always been, he at least feels to a lot of people in the province to be on their side, to be looking out for them, to empathize. If that all just looks like a charade, then that's a real problem, I think, for the premier. And all he needs to lose is that 6 to 8% that maybe voted Liberal last time, have voted Liberal federally, that aren't progressive Conservatives, and that majority then becomes gone, potentially.
Well, and I wonder whether or not, and maybe this is trying to be too clever by half and be nuanced in this, where people aren't as fussed. They might think that, okay, we want to build housing and we're going to have green space that we're going to use, and they're going to flip some others into the restricted area, and all that logic makes sense. But that's not the issue. The issue then becomes, to your point, who benefited from this, and is there the perception somebody got tipped off? And I wondered to what degree, and I said in the next 6 months or 5 months, this is going to be an issue. We're going to get an AG report. We're going to get an Auditor General report on this. And it doesn't matter whether the Tories are going to shout and scream that she's out of her lane or anything like that. You know as well as I do that the press gallery at Queen's Park is just ravenous come December, because there's nothing else to talk about. And they will pour through that report page by page, paragraph by paragraph, right down to the punctuation points to get the story and the juice out of it. And that's where the danger lies, I think, to your point around the perception of what the Ford government is doing, whether it makes sense in terms of policy, protocol, who should be doing what, who has the authority to talk about this, will not matter if that report comes out the way it sounds like it's shaping up already.
Yeah, and I mean, every year a government's in power, those perceptions, I think, of it doing things not in the public interest, but in their own interest, grow. So there's a natural tendency as a government, 3 years from now, Doug Ford's going to have been in power 8 years. That's the equivalent of Justin Trudeau nationally right now, federally. And so, I think that Auditor General's report, if it is damning, if it does identify, some evidence, that's because the real where this stuff really hits the road is when people's perceptions are validated, right? Where people may have this sense, this guy Doug Ford, he seems to be too, chummy with these developers, and now there's hard evidence that backs that up. It's hard to defend against that, and it will spread like wildfire.
Well, and even in this case, given the personality of this particular Auditor General, I did some work years ago with the Canadian Council on Public-Private Partnerships, and the council was, and the movement of P3s was on the wrong end of Bonnie Lysyc's, not the evidence she found, but the commentary that she added to her findings. And that in and of itself probably speaks more loudly than some editorial boards in this country.
Yeah, and it's it's the language. You're right. That's her I guess editorial independence to say what she thinks might be going on, or connecting dots is those are the clips that are going to run over and over and over again. That could make this politically dangerous. So I think the point of this survey and the key finding is, the government would likely win again today, but there is this underlying unease about some of the things it's doing on big important policy files, and this overriding narrative that the result, because, and this is where again it becomes really problematic. If you're somebody who says, look, housing's a top issue, healthcare is a top issue, affordability is a top issue, and I don't feel that the government has delivered or done enough on any of those, and now it's because they're choosing to make decisions that help their friends, despite how challenging these issues are, that becomes extra, I think, damaging to the government's reputation.
Yeah, and then it's hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube, really. It's a really difficult fight, message-wise, campaign-wise. You're really going to have to work hard to distract people from all of that. Speaking of distractions, just your initial take on last week's cabinet shakeup. It's far from a shuffle. That was a major overhaul.
Yeah, it was a big shuffle, and we had released a poll last week that showed the Liberals down by 10 the day of the shuffle, and I think they needed to do something to start to signal to voters that, first, they understand that people are unhappy, although I don't think the Prime Minister at all, the day of that shuffle, suggested at any point that the reason for the shuffle was because their performance hadn't been up to scratch. Like, that is one of the areas, if we want to compare Justin Trudeau to Doug Ford at least has admitted his mistakes, walks them back, whatever. And people, I think, they appreciate that. Justin Trudeau, I don't believe, has really ever apologized for anything he has personally done. And so I look at this shuffle that one of the key things they missed doing was to signal to voters that the government's performance hasn't been as good as it should have been. If he had done that, I think that would have registered with people to say, at least he gets how we're feeling. Because 8 in 10 Canadians say they don't think this government deserves to be reelected. Only 1 in 5 do. The second thing is, as much as it was a big shuffle, it doesn't really feel like a reset, in the sense that the key economic ministers, the highest profile ministers are in the same jobs that they're in. And so, so what if the new Minister of Fisheries and Oceans is someone different? For those who are in that sector, that's important. But for the vast majority of Canadians, they don't know who the previous Fisheries and Oceans Minister was, and they will never probably get to know the new one unless that person makes a really bad mistake. And so I think this perhaps is the first step for the government to change course, but so it won't be sufficient for them to turn these numbers around.
Interesting that some of the commentary, much of it, I was listening to the podcast, The House, on the weekend, and Danielle Smith was on the show, and of course the Premier of Alberta. And out of everything, she was almost cheering for some of the changes. Like, she looked at it and said, these are all Alberta-friendly folks, but, Minister Guilbeault is the problem here. He is the environment minister who is, threatening our livelihood, threatening our economy, all over the question around what's going to happen with fossil fuel. And while I realize that she's probably the most vocal on that, she's not alone in that area. And, I wonder at what point was this Trudeau also, I'm in charge here and I'm going to put whoever I want in these big roles. This is a priority for us, and we don't give a rat's whatever what any one of the individual provinces or territories thinks about how we are going to manage big files like the environment.
You're right. It actually accentuates the people who stayed, right? It makes us ask the question, well, why are they staying? Well, it's because the Prime Minister agrees with their take on that issue, or believes what they've done so far is on the right track. So if you're somebody like Danielle Smith, who, is probably opposed to 100% of what Stephen Guilbeault believes and stands for, you're going to feel extra defensive because he's there despite how much change happened in that cabinet, right? And the same for Melanie Joly at Foreign Affairs, or Chrystia Freeland at Finance, right? These are individuals that the Prime Minister and his team clearly believe can't be moved or shouldn't be moved, or they fundamentally believe that they're the best choices to drive those issues forward. And I would say, the one area when you ask the Canadians to assess the performance of the federal government where people think they're doing generally a good job, or at least have a clear story, is climate change and the environment, right? They are the party that's always well ahead of the other two main ones when you ask people who's best on that issue. So, I think it's telling of not just who was shuffled, but who wasn't shuffled, and the power the Prime Minister wants to signal to everybody else about his priorities.
And I don't know that I would have caught myself saying this 6 months ago, but when I listened to Premier Smith, she sounded really rational. I followed along the mountain. There wasn't anything that hinted at some of the goofiness that preceded her reelection. And, I have to wonder back to, your earlier point in terms of how governments assess where they are and where they're going and admit your mistakes. She hadn't really done so out loud, but I'm thinking there was a serious conversation behind closed doors saying, here's how you need to really frame this, because you're not wrong. You're just approaching it the wrong way in terms of how they're messaging it. I thought, wow, didn't sound like the same person I heard 5 months ago.
Like about halfway through that election campaign in Alberta last year, it's almost like she finally understood that what she says matters and people are listening, and it can hurt a lot if you just, Dave, you've got a career as a radio host. You say a lot of things even on your podcast every single day. Well, Danielle Smith was a talk news host. Yeah. And so it's easy your goal is to rile people up. Not that shouldn't always be your goal as a political leader. And I think she's come around to that and has been a much more effective communicator basically since the leaders debate till now. And, I think proof's in the pudding in what you just described.
So you're suggesting that I have 30 years of archive tape to keep me in politics?
Yeah. When you announce your bid for Parliament next year, there's going to be a lot of Oppo research easily pulled out for you there, Dave.
That's it. The interesting thing, there's a few interesting things, though, in terms of messaging, and I thought they were rather subtle. And one of them was that, Minister Coletto was moved out of, I want to get this straight now, it was employment, workplace, diversity, and inclusion. There was this whole combination of things in her ministry. But her shining light departure was passing the Canada Disability Benefit Act. And she's been a champion of this and a very passionate champion of that particular piece of legislation. 2 weeks later, she's out of the job and there's a new minister. But what I found interesting is they've actually isolated that specific part of that portfolio to create a new ministry. And I know there are people watching this very closely in terms of where it's going to go, and we're working on a series on this right now. So it occurs to me that that's a very subtle, if not loud, message from the Liberals that this is in fact going to be something that we are going to pursue significantly and robustly in the coming weeks and months because we have put such a focus on it.
Yeah. I mean, I think cabinet shuffles, the structure of ministries, the titles they use are part of the tools that a government has to signal its priorities and to speak directly to stakeholders that care a lot about them. And so the fact that they put, they created in part a ministry targeting disabled Canadians, I think is a signal that they're going to take this issue seriously and they want to be seen as taking it seriously. I recall, another example, not perfectly analogous, but soon after the 2015 federal election, when Justin Trudeau first won, he appointed himself Minister of Youth. There had never been a Minister of Youth at the national level. And that was, again, a signal he had hoped to send to young people that, you've got a voice, you've got someone listening, and we're going to take this issue seriously. Now, I don't think any more Minister of Youth. He's certainly not it anymore. But at the time, it was a real moment, and I think the same is true, as you raise on this issue, that the government took the time and the effort to make it very clear that this issue was so important that we were going to signal it out in someone's portfolio.
So maybe what he really needed to do to make a real change was have a ministry of pissed off Albertans. So for one of those things, right?
Yeah, no, like, sorry, and it comes back to something I believe firmly. Like, so much of just governing is empathy.
Yeah.
Like being able to channel the frustrations that people have, and to say, I come back to it. If we haven't gotten it right on everything, and so this is a chance for us to reset, bring in a new team, and we're going to do better. I promise to do better. Every day we make those, we say these things to other people in our lives. We rarely hear it from our political leaders. And I don't know why. I don't know why they choose to not do that.
I know you were talking about taking a deeper and a more sort of a regular dive into our attitudes around immigration in this country. And it has come up in a number of ways over the last 3 or 4 months that I think has been really interesting to see how it's driven political agenda, editorial agenda across the country. But again, back to the cabinet shuffle. We have seen the immigration minister moved out of his portfolio, and now Sean Fraser is in housing. And while that might sound extreme, I think they're actually related, and they're fairly closely related.
They're definitely related, and they're definitely related in the public's mind. So, this is something I've been brewing on, in part because I think Canada's an aging country. We need immigration. We're not having enough babies to replace our population. And so from a public policy perspective, I support, and I think it's right for us to increase the number of people we welcome into the country. It's good for the country. It's good for the economy. But I also worry about the political implications of other policies that are related, like housing, like healthcare, that our governments of all levels haven't kept up with. And so we're seeing evidence of it in public opinion research that we've done and others have done, right? Because I think there's this myth that Canadians will accept unlimited amounts of immigration because it's part of our identity. It's Canada's welcoming. All those things are true, except when the pressure gets too much. And so last month, I asked some questions about our current immigration targets. 61% of Canadians thought they were too high. Very few believe that their communities need more immigrants. 41% of Canadians think their communities actually need less than they're getting now. And you mentioned housing. When we ask what impact these, 1 million new people coming into Canada, for example, last year is going to have, people see the upside, the availability of workers. They see it's going to drive economic growth, that it might even, make Canada's ability to attract new business and investment better. But they also see, and this is where the pain points are, the cost and availability of housing, congestion in traffic, and access to healthcare. Majorities across the country, including a sizable plurality of Liberals and New Democrats, say it's having a negative effect on these things. So I think that on the one hand, when you see Sean Fraser move from immigration, and he got lots of kudos for getting this file right, for making sure that that the government could process this incredible number of new people coming into the country, he now has this really challenging task to figure out how do we build enough homes for everybody, because our housing starts in the last year are at close to record lows, and we're not keeping up. And I fear, and on my last point, Dave, I fear right now there's been an elite consensus in Canada. None of the political parties, other than maybe Max Bernier, and I wouldn't consider him in the mainstream, don't debate immigration, right? You don't have a conservative party like you do in the Republicans in the US or the conservatives in the UK or many conservative parties in Europe arguing for less immigration, closing the borders, right? Reducing refugees, you name it. Canada, we don't have those debates. And I think that's benefited us. It's allowed us to find common ground. But the public opinion signals to me that an enterprising political leader, if he wanted or she wanted to figure out how to win an election, immigration could be an issue that could spark a more intense emotional debate than we really want to have, and that we've ever had, I think, not ever, but certainly in my lifetime ever had in Canada.
Yeah, and I can see how that could be healthy, but could easily get out of control. It was like, fighting fire with fire almost in some cases. There would be some jeopardy in that if we're not careful about how we approach it. And again, I get your point about maybe we're being too careful to begin with.
Well, I think so. I mean, we asked a question on a survey we just finished, the same one we talked about earlier, when we asked people, well, if a party promised to cut immigration, reduce the number of people, would you be more or less likely to vote for it? And 4 in 10 said they'd be more likely, and 1 in 4 said they'd be less likely. So you already see some polarization on this debate. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't debate important issues. But the thing that I've been noticing, what sparked my interest in this, is I've been hearing anecdotally more and more people in my day-to-day life coming up to me and saying, David, I'm pro-immigration, but right? Mm-hmm. And it's usually housing, healthcare. We're growing too fast. We're not keeping up. And you look at the problems facing most big cities in this country. You look at our provincial healthcare systems. People are worried now. What happens when we let the next million in, right? And I think we need that million, but we also need government to move much quicker in building the capacity on all areas to deal with the influx of people that are coming.
Well, to me, and again, I'm just the kind of guy sitting on the sidelines watching, but it occurs to me that the conversation that perhaps we're not having robustly enough either in that context is recalibrating an economy that supports that level of immigration influx in this country. Because people will tell you, well, they're taking our jobs. Well, there's all kinds of jobs out there, but the jobs are crappy and they're not paying well. And so all of a sudden, so what if you've got somebody coming in to the country with certain skill levels? We don't have those jobs available for them, but we can give them, a $15 an hour job flipping burgers or something else that's less satisfying and is less stable. To me, I think it's an economic lens that we like a larger economy than just housing is going to drive a lot of that economy, but we're not having that conversation either, as if we're afraid to have it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because a lot of times anti-immigration sentiment is built around the fear they're going to take jobs. I don't see that much in Canada yet, to your point, because we've just come out of a period for the last 2 years where every Canadian, every person has experienced the labor shortage in some way, whether it's like a McDonald's that's closed that you've never seen before, or you go to a hotel and you can't get room service, or or just general, decline in quality customer service is an indicator of how challenging it's been to get people to do certain types of work. But it's not that. But what I'm seeing is not that people are saying that these immigrants are going to take my jobs. It's they're going to take my family doctor, or they're going to make it harder for me to get a family doctor because I've been waiting for 3 years and I still haven't got one, or they're going to make it harder for my son or daughter to buy a home, or to pay the rent, or to live close to me where I want them to be, right? So everybody's going to be able, the problem with immigration, it's so easy to point the finger and say it's their fault. And this is so, this is another policy area where we knew this was going to happen, right? Like I'm reading this really interesting book about the baby boom generation's impact on the US, and it applies to Canada. Like every step of the way, we've underestimated the impact, Dave, of that generation. When they were born, there was a diaper shortage, and then there was classroom shortages, and now guess what? We're not going to have enough long-term care or aging services for my parents' generation. And so we knew for 20 years that we would have to increase immigration if we were going to keep our population growing. And yet governments haven't invested in the infrastructure and services that they need. So yeah, I think this is going to be, if maybe not the most important issue. It all depends on whether the political parties want to debate it. But it's happened in other countries, and I think it'd be wrong for us to assume it couldn't happen here either.
Well, not debating it doesn't mean it's not going to be an issue. It might just well be the issue that means that healthcare becomes deteriorated and housing is more difficult and more expensive, and groceries are more expensive and harder to get, and supply chain issues. So all of these things are happening. It just because we don't talk about them doesn't mean, right? We aren't going to suffer as a result of that willful ignorance. So, David, it's always good to talk to you. Thanks for taking time on Monday, and I hope you get to enjoy these last few glorious weeks of your summer.
I plan to, and great to see you, Dave. Have a good week.
You too.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.